Return to Rome. The Pope reflects on his trip to Mexico and the debate about the border. Reaching out to Cuba. Why President Obama's upcoming trip to the communist nation causes controversy. Presidential politics. Former candidate Rick Santorum joins us tonight. And remembering Justice Scalia. One of America's top attorneys tells what made his former boss so special. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, February 18th, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Brian Patrick. Two trips are making news tonight. One just completed, the other just announced. President Obama plans a controversial trip to Cuba, the first by an American president in decades. Meanwhile, Pope Francis returns from Mexico, where he fueled the immigration debate. EWTN's Alan Holdren just flew back from Mexico with Pope Francis aboard the papal plane. Alan, the Pope fielded some tough questions, as he normally does on these flights. What did he say about criticism from Donald Trump that he's merely a pawn of the Mexican government?
Well, Brian, that question was also prefaced with the fact that the journalist told the Pope that Donald Trump would send a lot of immigrants back over the border and build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. And Pope Francis just responded saying, anyone who would build walls instead of bridges is not a Christian. And he said that that's not in the gospel. And he said he doesn't know if Donald Trump had said these words against him or not. He would have to look into that.
In a moment, Trump says he is proud to be a Christian and is surprised the Pope questions his faith.
For a religious leader to question a person's faith is disgraceful. I'm proud to be a Christian, and as president, I will not allow Christianity to be consistently attacked and weakened, unlike what is happening now with our current president.
Trump says illegal immigration is dangerous for the United States. He claims the Mexican government used Pope Francis as its pawn. Alan Holdren has more on the Pope's in-flight news conference in just minutes. But first, we turn to Chief White House correspondent and political director Lauren Ashburn for details of the president's plans. Lauren?
Brian, President Obama announced he will visit Cuba next month. It's part of the administration's plan to advance efforts to restore U.S.-Cuban ties. Obama will become the first sitting president to visit Cuba since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. It's a move that is not popular with Republican presidential candidates. Cuban President Raul Castro and President Obama met last spring at the Summit of the Americas in Panama City, but never in Cuba. The U.S. restored diplomatic relations with Cuba in late 2014. Since then, travel restrictions to the country have eased. At last night's Republican town hall, the two Cuban-American presidential candidates found common ground on one issue: denouncing President Obama.
I think it's a real mistake. I think the president ought to instead be pushing for a free Cuba.
I'll tell you the problem with the Cuban government is it's not just a communist dictatorship. It is an anti-American communist dictatorship.
At the White House today, Ben Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor for Communications, explained why the trip is important.
The long-standing approach that those senators have supported has failed to produce any results. The Cuban government is still in place. It's not as if, one more year of the embargo is going to bring transformational change.
In the press briefing room today, Rhodes also said that the president will meet with dissidents, and he acknowledged there are significant issues on human rights, including freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. Joining us right now in studio is former Republican presidential candidate Rick Santorum. So you just heard two of your former colleagues in the Republican presidential race, both of Cuban descent, speak out vehemently against this plan. Is it a good idea for President Obama to go to Cuba?
Not at all.
Why?
Well, because what you're doing is you're conferring American, giving American credibility to a couple of leaders who have demonstrated no interest at all in moving their country away from this oppressive communistic system they have. There are more political prisoners now in Cuba than there was before the opening. So I listened to the spokesperson talk about, well, there hasn't been any change. Well, there has been change since President Obama opened things up. Things have gotten worse in Cuba. Because we have now given them our imprimatur that everything is okay and that we're going to open up relationships with them without asking them to do anything, without getting anything in return. That is just I just wish he would be as easy on negotiating with Republicans as he is in negotiating with dictators.
Well, speaking about Republicans and presidential politics, the other big story is that the Pope's comments on the papal plane today about Donald Trump. Now, as a Catholic, a practicing Catholic, and a Republican who actually was a candidate for president and ran in these circles for quite some time, do you think the faithful will take note of this, and will it reflect so on the ballot?
I read the Pope's comments. I mean, he gives these interviews on the airplanes, and it's always sort of, okay, what did he really mean by all this? It's usually not exactly as reported. Usually it's, as you saw, he made a general statement about building bridges instead of building walls, and if he said that, it wasn't.
He gave him the benefit of the doubt.
And he gave him the benefit of the doubt.
It was all couched.
It was all couched in typical diplomatic pontifical speech. He wasn't calling Donald Trump a bad Christian,
right. But that's not what shows up.
That's not what shows
in the papers,
up,
right?
And it's one of those things where our Pope is a pastor, not a theologian who's speaking as a theologian. He's a pastor who speaks as a pastor, as you would talk to your neighborhood pastor. And that's why people like him so much, because he doesn't speak in these very specific terms. He speaks more off the cuff, and as a result, it can be subject to misinterpretation. The Pope hasn't changed his teaching on what is a good Christian and what isn't a good Christian, and he hasn't changed his teaching, from what I understand, on contraception. And
that's a different issue. We haven't prefaced that yet.
Right. I mean, all the things that he's commented on, they are well within his right to be able to speak as a person about how he believes.
What he was talking about, what you alluded to, was the fact that the Zika virus, and there has been some indications that there should be contraception used so that the Zika virus isn't transmitted, and he said that contraception isn't inherently evil, and that is another piece of the story.
Right, he was juxtaposed with abortion, which is always
inherently evil, what he said.
And he was juxtaposing the two.
So let's move on to why you're here. You're not supposed to be here right now. We're lucky enough to have you, but you were supposed to be speaking in South Carolina at an event for Marco Rubio, but you are here for Justice Scalia's funeral. Tell us about your relationship with him. I know you had a good one.
Well, I was very blessed in having the opportunity to get to know him a little deeper than most, not certainly the people who worked with him, but he attended church at our church, so had many opportunities after Mass to hold court, if you will. With,
I think he was holding court.
With Maureen and Nino, and the same thing. When I was in the United States Senate, I was treated on a few occasions to lunch at the AV Pizzeria, which was that really is where he held court. And it was quite a treat to have an opportunity to get to know him better and to just see the tremendous wisdom of that man, the great wit that he had, very, very strongly opinionated, and I found myself in agreement with him. Not all the time. There was occasionally he would make a decision that I would scratch my head, but he was the one thing about Scalia. He was pretty predictable, and that's what you want out of a Supreme Court justice, someone who's predictable because he's sticking to what the text of the Constitution said.
Well, Senator Santorum, thank you so much for making time out of your schedule to join us here. And Brian, back to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Lauren. Let's go back to Alan Holdren now, who just returned to Rome with Pope Francis from Mexico. Alan, during his in-flight news conference, what did the Pope say about divorced Catholics who have entered into another union?
Well, he said this is a major statement that comes from Pope Francis, something that the Church has been waiting for 2 years, the world has been waiting for. He said that there's not going to be any change for Catholics who are divorced and enter into a second union about receiving communion at Mass. He said that they can be integrated in many, many ways and be in communion with the Church, in full communion. He cited this couple that spoke at an event in Mexico this week who spoke about their involvement in church life through hospital visits and all kinds of other pastoral ways. And so he said that we can expect this teaching, this document, to come as a result of the synods here before Easter. So we'll have that answer in the clear very soon.
Also, in response to a question about the Zika virus and efforts to try to relax some abortion laws in especially Catholic countries in Latin America, how did he respond to that?
He came out really strong, Brian. He said that abortion in any case is an absolute evil and it's a crime. He said the mafia works to get rid of people in that same way. He said in no case would abortion be illicit.
And finally, doesn't he keep an image of the Blessed Mother in front of him pretty much at all times on these flights?
Yeah, that's right. He goes and visits Our Lady here in Rome before he leaves on the plane. When he gets on the plane, he's got an icon right in front of him. On this Mexico trip, it was an icon of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which was the reason, of course, that he went to Mexico to visit her shrine there, which is the most visited Catholic shrine on earth, actually.
And when he returned, of course, he visited the icon at St. Mary Major. How did he look on the way home? He had to have been tired.
He did. He did look tired. He started off, I think, like all of us. We didn't get much sleep this week, but he started off stumbling over his words in the in-flight press conference. But as on all occasions, really, he's an amazing person. He feeds off the energy of the people who are with him. And after a couple of questions, he was on a roll. So that's Pope Francis for you.
Well, we pray that he's getting some rest and that you get some rest and time with your family. Thank you for being our eyes and ears on this papal trip, Alan.
Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome. Well, the Pope's Mexico trip climaxed with a powerfully symbolic celebration of the Holy Mass in the border city of Juarez. Mary Shovlin reports.
Once more during Pope Francis's trip to Mexico, his actions spoke louder than words. Before celebrating the last Mass of his trip, the Pope paused at the border fence between Mexico and the United States to pray for the thousands of migrants who died trying to reach the other side. He laid a bouquet of flowers next to a large crucifix that is to remain at the site as a monument to his visit. Pope Francis's huge open-air Mass yesterday was in the northern border town of Ciudad Juarez. It was beamed live into the Sun Bowl Stadium on the other side of the border in El Paso.
Injusticia.
In his homily, Pope Francis stopped short of calling on the U.S. to open its borders, but he did ask for open hearts for those fleeing gang violence and extortion in their homelands. Isauro Mendez says the most touching moment for the family was when the Pope walked up to the cross, because everyone here in Ciudad Juarez has a migrant relative. In his closing remarks before leaving for Rome, Pope Francis thanked the Mexican people for their hospitality and ended his trip much as it began, with a prayer to Our Lady of Guadalupe that they would be missionaries of mercy and hope. In Rome, Mary Shovlin, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mary. EWTN's challenge to the Health and Human Services contraception mandate suffers a legal setback today. In a split decision, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against our network. The court did, however, continue the injunction that prevents enforcement of that mandate for now. This until the Supreme Court considers pending cases scheduled for oral argument next month. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker signs legislation today cutting millions of taxpayers' dollars for Planned Parenthood in his state. He signed two bills at Life's Connection, that's a pro-life pregnancy center in Waukesha. One bill restricts how much Planned Parenthood can be reimbursed for prescription drugs. The other prevents the state from passing federal funds to an organization or affiliate that provides abortions. Justice Antonin Scalia will be remembered tomorrow at the court he served for 30 years. He'll be buried Saturday after the celebration of the Mass that nourished his soul for decades. Jason Calvi reports tonight. Jason?
Brian, Justice Scalia's funeral mass will be right behind me Saturday at 11. This is North America's largest Catholic church, the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. Justice Scalia was a devout Catholic who passed a love of the law on to the next generation.
Paul Clement's name was put forward as a possible Supreme Court pick for Republican nominees McCain and Romney.
To be honest, I'm so focused on Justice Scalia's legacy right now because, I mean, he's meant a tremendous amount to me personally, but he's meant so much to the Supreme Court.
He started his prestigious career as a law clerk for Justice Scalia.
What I think the justice conveyed to his clerks was that he really had a love of the law.
Clement went on to serve the Bush administration as U.S. Solicitor General. In that role and then afterwards, he's argued 80 cases in front of the High Court.
He so much enjoyed the give and take of the argument that, and he really wanted it to be a give and take.
And that's a lasting legacy here. Justice Scalia started the rapid-fire questions and answers that now make up the Supreme Court's oral arguments.
It's absurd to say that, it comes out of nowhere.
Absolutely, Your Honor. And this, by the way, this $2,000 penalty
It is very typical these days to, in a 30-minute argument, get 50 questions.
Justice Scalia also leaves behind 30 years of colorful court opinions.
There's always a couple of lines that will kind of stick with you for years.
And I'm curious, when you teach law across the street at Georgetown, how does that style impact your students?
I've had any number of students from across the ideological spectrum essentially confide in me that they almost always start with the Scalia opinion because it's going to make the issues clear. They're going to actually be able to understand what the issue is about, and then they're going to be written in this memorable style that really does get to the heart of the issue.
And to pay tribute to Justice Scalia, the family is asking for donations. Instead of flowers, donations. Take a look to these organizations: the Supreme Court Historical Society, Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Arlington, and the Benedictines of Mary, Queen of Apostle. Justice Scalia's son, Father Paul Scalia, will preach and celebrate the funeral mass right here on Saturday. We'll be broadcasting that live on EWTN Saturday morning at 11. Brian?
Coming up, a shortage of help for troops suffering from post-traumatic stress. And the San Bernardino terror investigation sparks debate over privacy and national security. Thanks for being with us on this Thursday evening. For EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thousands of active duty troops suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. A massive study released today shows the military is struggling to provide the health care they need. Wyatt Goolsby examines that study for us tonight.
Yeah, Brian, it's obvious from this study that there are areas where the military can provide better health services. The RAND Corporation reviewed roughly 40,000 cases. It shows a vast majority of patients diagnosed with PTSD or depression got at least one mental therapy visit. That's good, but in most cases, it's not enough. The group found many of the troops with PTSD and depression are not getting the minimum number of therapy sessions or follow-up sessions for checking on their medicine. Kimberly Helpner, the lead author of the study and a clinical psychologist, says those follow-ups are critical for treating PTSD or depression.
It's a really essential time when you start a new medication treatment for ensuring that the service member has a good outcome, adjusting the medication, the dose, checking for side effects, addressing any concerns about taking the medication that the service member might have. And so that kind of follow-up visit is really essential for providing excellent care.
This study does not recommend how the Department of Defense can fix the problems. A high-ranking defense official says one of the problems may be a lack of mental health professionals, saying the military will work to improve their health system. Brian?
All right, thank you, Wyatt. Well, this could set a dangerous precedent. The FBI needs help from Apple to unlock an iPhone used by the terrorists in the San Bernardino shooting, but the tech giant refuses over concerns about privacy for all the other iPhone users. Dr. Claude Barfield specializes in science and technology policy at the American Enterprise Institute. So what does the FBI want, and can they force Apple to get it?
Well, what they ultimately want is to be able to break the so-called encryption code that keeps you from finding the data on the iPhone. And there's been a standoff of that for several years. So in this particular case, the iPhone related to the San Bernardino killer, what they really want Apple to do is to give them, to go bypass what they've got, the code they've got now, to allow them to, what is called brute force, to take computers and millions and millions of algorithms to get inside the phone. The problem
basically.
Yeah, they break in. Yeah. The problem they face is the way the Apple phone is set up. If you fail 10 times, then all the data is destroyed.
Erased.
And that's what they want Apple to get around.
Yeah.
And Apple says, well, that's okay, that'd be fine for this phone, but the precedent set that you can just break into the phone is something we do not want to get involved with.
It seems logical, though, that in a terrorism case, a suspected terrorist, that they need access. So the problem is what the implications for everybody else.
That's true, and the problem also is that, and this has been the case why the standoff is, it is what Apple and the others are saying, and nobody has challenged this, is that if we weaken the encryption here, we will weaken the encryption so that the Chinese can get in, the Russians can get in, murderers, terrorists, anyone can get in. You have weakened encryption or the source code around the world. So you're ultimately going to be chasing your tail, and you're opening up a can of worms that will make things worse down the road than we have now.
Be an interesting case to follow, and we appreciate your expertise, Dr. Claude Barfield, the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Up next, a closer look at the city hosting the Pope's border mass, how people in Juarez are trying to overcome a culture of violence, and more fallout from the president's plan to visit Cuba. As Alan mentioned, Pope Francis makes a stop at St. Mary Major Basilica in Rome today after returning from Mexico. He visits the icon of the Madonna and Child before and after each of his apostolic journeys, bringing a beautiful bouquet of flowers. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Brian Patrick. The gritty border city of Juarez, Mexico is basking in the glow of this week's papal visit. Not long ago, it was considered the murder capital of the world. That is changing, but one young man hasn't forgotten those dark days. Susie Pinto reports from Juarez.
Esteban grew up in this neighborhood in Juarez. Like many kids here, he joined a gang at age 14.
Era unirte a la pandilla o ser tú la víctima de ellos.
He had no other option, he says. Gangs in this border town offer young kids the prospect of easy money and a better life. They also cause much of the violence the city has seen in recent years.
Algunos amigos míos de la pandilla ya fallecieron.
Esteban says some of his gang friends are now dead. A violent shootout was the beginning of a deep conversion.
When Jesus is waiting for all the people,
Esteban turned to God and Father Roberto Luna, who had a message.
The church is your house, it's your home, and then it's the house of God that it's saying to all of us, come to my house.
That house is now Esteban's second home. He's an active parishioner teaching confirmation classes to kids. For him and some Juarez residents, the Holy Father's visit could be the start of a new era.
This is just like a big dream, that he could just be here, touch the city, just give his blessing to the city. I think for Juarez, it's extra special because of what we lived through.
Esteban will soon be finishing a degree in industrial engineering. He's happy with his new life and looking forward to the next chapter.
Susie Pinto in Juarez. President Obama says he'll raise human rights concerns with President Raul Castro when he visits Cuba next month. He plans to meet with groups advocating for change in the communist nation, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Mike Gonzalez is with the Heritage Foundation. He works on international studies. You're also a Cuban-American, a journalist covering Latin America. How would you suggest that the president address these issues with Castro?
But I don't think he will do it. But what he should do, obviously, is make a grand statement, make a Reagan at the wall statement. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He could really, when he's addressing the press there with Raul Castro by his side, he should say, General Castro allowed the Cuban people to vote. He should say something like what John Paul II said in Poland: "Be not afraid," say to the Cuban people. Barack Obama will not do any of these things, but this is what he should do.
Now, he says he will meet with groups that are opposing the government in some ways. Will they be even able to speak openly to him?
Well, I don't think he's going to meet with the right groups. I just talked to one of the dissident leaders, Antonio Rodiles, by phone, and he's very dispirited by the fact that the White House said it's going to be just like Mexico, just like Panama City. And he's referring to the Summit of the Americas, in which President Obama met only with the approved dissidents. So we have to be very clear when they talk about civic society or civil society. What the Cuban government refers to as civil society is the pre-approved groups, the groups that approved of communist oppression.
It'll all be orchestrated.
Yes, it will, completely orchestrated.
So Senators Cruz and Rubio, both Cuban-Americans, oppose this visit strongly. Do you think any of these policies can be reversed under a Republican president?
Oh, yeah, of course it can. I mean, many things can be done. Any president who comes in can start speaking the truth about Cuba, can start calling the dictators by what they are, dictators, can start saying, look, the Cuban government needs to allow the Cuban people to finally elect their own leaders after 56 years of dictatorship. Any American leader that does that will undo a lot of the damage that Barack Obama has done.
Mike Gonzalez with the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Until tomorrow, for our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night. God bless.